a young adult science fiction series called The Cage, which is about a race of super intelligent and also super attractive aliens who take teenagers and put them in a human zoo. The next one coming out for me is the third book in the Legend trilogy, the last one, called Champion, and I have no idea when it's coming out yet, but hopefully this year, maybe next year. And aside from that, I'm working on a new series, and I can't say anything about it yet, but it will be high fantasy, somewhere along the lines of like Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, that sort of thing.
The next thing I'm working on is a trilogy, and I can say that it's a sci-fi thriller, and that's all I'm allowed to say, because it's still kind of hush-hush, it's not been released yet. I've got 3 more coming up.
Yes.
The next book in the Lunar Chronicles is called Cress. It is my Rapunzel retelling, except she is a computer hacker that is stuck in a satellite orbiting Earth as opposed to a tower. Book 4 is Winter. That's my Snow White story, in which Snow White is like a revolutionary rebellion leader type. I don't know, I'm still writing it. And then I did just sell one new book to my publisher, and that is a YA fantasy novel.
I'll just speak at a distance. I have the second book in the archive series called The Unbound, and it comes out next January. And before that, this September, I have my first adult novel comes out, and it's superheroes, or rather supervillains. It's called Vicious, and it's about 2 pre-med students that discover the key to superpowers are near-death experiences. So they set out to manufacture their own supernatural abilities by controlling their own deaths, and hopefully resurrections, and it all goes horribly wrong.
Okay, why don't you pick our next person?
Want to pick the next question? The girl in the black shirt. Yeah. What inspired us to start writing our books? Like our books specifically, or to start writing in general? Do you know? In general? Okay, yeah. I'll go first because I already have the mic in my hand. I have been writing as long as I can remember, but I actually started out writing really bad poetry. Like as probably like a middle schooler, just absolutely just horrible, horrible poetry, which I am thoroughly convinced is a gateway to like less bad poetry. And then eventually to like poetry that's not bad at all. And then hopefully like, you know, good poetry. By the time I graduated high school, I was poet laureate, and I was really into that. And I got to college, and I wasn't really sure what form I wanted writing to take. I knew I loved telling stories. I knew I loved the sound that words made when they went together. And so I tried screenwriting, and I tried short fiction, and more poetry, and I ended up writing my first book as a sophomore in college, and it was horrible. And then I wrote another one that was significantly less bad, and that's The Near, well, hopefully, I guess less bad. I don't comment on my own books, but as a senior in college, I wrote The Near Witch, so.
I grew up knowing that I wanted to be a writer. I think pretty much as soon as I realized that was an actual job that you could actually get paid for, I was like, that's for me. That's what I want to do. So I was kind of just always dabbling with writing when I was a little kid, and then I got serious about it when I was a teenager, and I started writing Sailor Moon fan fiction. Moonies. Darn. A lot of times at an event, I'll say Sailor Moon, and I'll be like, one person in the back who's like, oh, no, power. Anyway, so I wrote Sailor Moon fan fiction for like 10 years, and during that time I, tried to write a novel, but it never really worked, and I never finished any, but then I had the idea for Cinder, and was like, okay, I really love this idea, I have to try to write it and finish it and get it published, and I did.
Much like Victoria, I wrote my first novel when I was a sophomore, and at the time I thought it was ever so brilliant, and it would be published, and it was soundly rejected all over the place. And so then as a junior, I wrote my next one, and it was also very much rejected. And then when I was a senior, I wrote the next one, and this is the point when Victoria gets published, and I get rejected again. So now we're up to 3, and I did that again for 7 more times. I wrote 10 novels for 10 years, and they were all rejected. At dinner, we were talking about it. I think I have roughly 1,000 or so rejections for my novels. So that wasn't soul-crushing at all. And when it came time to write Across the Universe, universe, it was my last-ditch effort. I was about to give up, and all of my 10 novels before were fantasy, and they were all different, and it was magical kind of things, and I was like, well, I'll just do something entirely different, and so I wrote a sci-fi, and I had never written from a boy's point of view, so half the book is from a boy's point of view, and I'd never written present tense, but that's what that one was, and that book that was so different was the one that ended up changing everything, so.
I started technically writing when I was like 5, when I just came over to the United States from China, and my mom sort of gave me an assignment to learn more English. So I had to like go to school every day and write down like 5 English words, and then go home and like look them up. And I looked up all sorts of like, because I didn't know that like, you know, when words wrap around, you know, you get like a num-ver, it was like number is a full word, and I didn't know that, so I wrote down all sorts of like half words, things that didn't make sense. Like, my parents were like, well, she must know what she's doing, because she's saying it in school, so it must be the right word. So it was kind of like a rough start, but that was kind of why I started writing, was to teach myself the language. And then as I started doing it more, I just realized I really enjoyed it. I mean, I liked all creative things. I liked to draw a lot, I liked to play games, I liked those things. And so I was writing constantly as a kid, and I didn't start writing seriously until like Marissa in high school, when I figured out that it was like, well, you probably figured out earlier than I did, but in high school I figured out that it was a real job that people could do, to write books, and that was when I realized, like, okay, I think I want to be like an actual writer of books. So I wrote my first book when I was a sophomore, and it was really awful, like really, really awful. And of course, it got rejected by like everybody. And I wrote another one, and I wrote 4 more that were all rejected until I ended up writing Legend, and that was finally the one that sold. So also a lot of soul pushing going on.
I grew up in a bookstore. My family owned an independent bookstore, but I never even considered being a writer, even though I loved reading. And I thought I was going to be a world traveler and join foreign service. And after college, I joined the Peace Corps and spent 2 years in Senegal doing environmental education. And one of my projects there just happened to be compiling oral folk tales from the elders in my village, and I got a local artist to illustrate them, and so kind of turned it into a picture book for the local kids. And I just really fell in love with children's literature from that project. And when I came back to the U.S., I thought, you know, like I'm interested in this, like I'd like to try to write picture books. So I started writing picture books, and I realized they're far too sweet and there's not enough cursing. So then I moved to middle grade, and I thought I would write for kind of a elementary school, middle school age. And eventually I wrote 2 or 3 books for that age, and it just didn't feel right, and they didn't sell. And so then I moved to young adult and felt like that's really where I belonged, and then I wrote The Mad Next Door. Well, I didn't set out to write as historical fiction. I wanted to write a thriller that was just set on a mysterious island. I loved the TV show Lost, and everything they did with interesting backstories with the characters. And so I kind of started thinking, okay, what can I do with a mysterious island? What if it was set in the past? What if it was a mad scientist? And then I remembered, oh, H.G. Wells already did that 100 years ago. And so I went back just to reread it for pleasure, and realized that it's a novella. It's got ideas that are so relevant still today, but there's no female characters. And I just really felt like there was a lot of potential to re-examine a lot of the ideas in that book from a new story to a new character.
For Legend in particular, I first came up with the idea one afternoon a few years ago when I was watching the old movie version of Les Miserables on TV. This is the one with Liam Neeson in it, as Valjean. And I remember it was just on TV, and I was like lying on the carpet in my living room, just not doing anything. And I was watching it, and I was watching, you know, the criminal versus detective thing, and I just suddenly thought, oh, it would be really cool to do a teenage version of this kind of story, like the teenage criminal versus the teenage detective. And that was like the first seed of inspiration for Legend. And I sort of put that aside in my head, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna wait for a little bit and see what happens with this idea. And then a couple weeks later, I was online, and I was reading an article, and I saw this simulated map of what our world will look like if all of our freshwater ice melted and our oceans rose by 100 meters. And it was fascinating to see how the world had changed because like Europe was completely gone. And in the United States, almost the entire southeastern coast where we are was underwater. And in California, which is where I'm from, there's a huge lake that stretched from Los Angeles all the way up to San Francisco. And I'm from Los Angeles, so I thought it would be really fun to destroy my hometown and kind of flood everything and make it awful. And for anyone who hasn't been to Los Angeles, it's a little bit dystopian already. So it's not too far off to make it a little more crazy. So I just flooded downtown, kind of made everything a little bit worse than it already is. And I was like, this would be really fun. So I combined that setting with the idea of a teenage criminal and a teenage detective, and that was the inspiration for the book.
I don't want to give too much of my inspiration away because it's kind of a spoiler. But the inspiration for my book really came from the end. I had an idea that I wanted to do something called an unreliable narrator. And that's where the person who's telling you the story, you can't trust that person. And that person is telling you something that's definitely a lie. And so I thought it would be really interesting to craft a mystery where the person who did the bad thing was the one who's telling you the story, and then you figure it out. That would be awesome. So I knew I wanted to have a murder mystery, and I had all that set out. And the original idea I had was to put it on a cruise ship, because I needed like an enclosed area where nobody could escape. And I was like, cruise ship. And then I was like, cruise ships are kind of lame. Spaceship. And so it turned into a spaceship, and everything else fell into place after that.
You should like try and rewrite like a short novelette of like, if it get on the cruise ship. How would it be different? Let's see, for me, I always loved fairy tales. I mean, I've grown up loving fairy tales since I was a little kid. Grew up on Disney movies like everybody does. But when I was a teenager, I read a lot of retellings, and it turns out Cinderella is the most retold story in the history of stories. There's like 8 billion different versions of it. And so I knew, like, if I was ever going to write my own retelling of a fairy tale, I wanted to have a twist that I couldn't find anybody had done before. I wanted to be, truly unique. And so I going about my life and writing fan fiction, blah, 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 and one day I entered a writing contest, and the girl who was hosting the contest had made a list of 10 things, and you had to choose 2 of the things from that list to include in a short story. So from her list, I chose to include a fairy tale character, because, like I said, I love fairy tales, and to set it in the future. I'd never written any science fiction at all, but I thought it sounded like a neat challenge. And so I ended up writing this short story of Puss in Boots. And then, a little while later, I found out that mine was one of only 2 stories that had been entered into the writing contest. And it came in 2nd place. So I don't know, maybe a lot of writers would be like, okay, science fiction, clearly not for me. But I came away from that thinking that was so much fun to write, and I couldn't find that anybody else had combined these 2 things that seem very at odds with each other. And so I just started thinking, what else can I do with fairy tales and science fiction? And that eventually grew into Cinder and the Liver Chronicles.
I started writing The Near Witch when I was still in college, and I was studying classic fairy tales at the time, and I was so fascinated by them. I love them. The original ones were very, very dark. Toes getting chopped off and people burning to death and knives and all that stuff. Anyway, but I loved them. But the problem that I had with them was that one of the reasons that so many classic fairy tales feel so timeless is because they have very sparse setting. They don't do setting very much. And so I kind of had a challenge to myself. I was a senior, and I was studying these things. I thought it'd be really cool to write a fairy tale where setting is not only important, it's a character. And so when I wrote The Near Witch, the village of Near, the place where the story takes place, is very much one of the main characters of the story. So it was originally a challenge to myself. And then when it came time for the archive, it started again in a place of setting. I had 2 very distinct settings in my mind. Before I had a story to go with them. I had this hotel that had been converted into apartment buildings in like the heyday following World War II, this like very wealthy thing that had then slowly collapsed over time and was just falling into disrepair. And I had this strange, infinite archive, this place where the lives of the dead were shelved. And it came from me deciding I wanted a girl that was living in both worlds simultaneously. So it definitely came from a place of setting in both places then.
I really love that you have a very intelligent answer, and mine was just like, I'm blowing stuff up in space.
I mean, I was gonna say, I envy that. One day maybe I will blow things up too. Not in space, probably. No.
Do we have another question? I saw your hand first, didn't you?
Do publishers of young adult literature these days have an expectation that you will write a series, or do they ever just sign one book and say, you don't have to write a sequel?
Victoria?
Well, my first book's a standalone. Yeah, so The Near Witch is a self-contained story. And I even though The Archived is a series, I do not care to write cliffhangers, and so I really think that every book in a series, I like it to have a contained story arc, so that you could potentially read it as a standalone. Basically a save the day, not the world kind of ending. So even though I do write series, I also write standalone at the same time, and I have found like that there's definitely an audience for both. You know, you'll write standalones and people will be like, oh, thank goodness, I really want more standalones. And you'll write series and people are like, oh, thank goodness, I love series. Like there's a readership for both of them.
Definitely. And I also, there's always exceptions, but it also seems to be partly dictated by genre. You know, with science fiction and fantasy, you get a lot of series, whereas more like contemporary romances tend to be more standalones. But again, there are exceptions to every rule. But I think that, these days a lot of writers are seeing the potential of series, and publishers see them too. You know, if you can build a series over time, then there's money to be made there, and publishers like that. But I also think that, you know, if a story only requires one book for it, then, you know, people need to be aware of that too. So it varies.
I think it also helps if you go into it thinking that it's a one story, like you were saying, it needs to be self-contained. When I wrote Across the Universe, it was intended as a standalone, and it was going to end exactly the same way it ends now, and you just were never going to find out what happened next. And the publisher was like, well, what if we turn it into a trilogy? And I found a way to make it be 3, but it sold because it could have been 1.
Yeah, I think it's it varies, like Marissa said, from genre to genre, and for me, I grew up reading almost nothing but sci-fi and fantasy, so I always think in terms of like longer than one book. So when I pitched it, I knew it was going to be longer than one book. So my publisher didn't really choose that. I had already sort of chosen it. I'm not entirely sure if I would ever be capable of writing a standalone, but it sounds interesting. Like I would have to change the way that I think about the way I write stories. Yeah. I had something else, but I totally blanked on it. Maybe I'll think of it later.
The Madman's Daughter was my debut book, and for an author's first book, the general advice tends to be write a standalone, because publishers are already taking a chance on you because you don't have any previous books. And so it's a lot easier for them to say, okay, we're going to take a chance on you with 1 book rather than 3 books. So that's why I wrote it as a standalone, and much like Beth, mine ended, it's a full story, but it ends on a little bit of a cliffhanger, and my agent and the editor said there's definitely potential to expand this. But my other series is a trilogy, and I planned it as a trilogy, and it's very different going into it, knowing that it's going to have a 3-book arc.
Just to add like the tail end, I think like standalones also can do really well if like the author has a certain brand around themselves. Like if you look at John Green, all of his books are standalone, but they fall in that contemporary category, and he has like a certain style, and they do phenomenally well. So it really varies. The green yellow shirt. Which series was the favorite? Oh, which book out of my series? Legend was the easiest to write. so in some ways that's like the favorite, but Prodigy was probably the most difficult to write so far. I say that because Champion, the 3rd book, is really kicking my butt. But Prodigy was really, really, really hard for me to write. It took me twice as long to get it down, and we went through twice as many revisions as we did with Legends. So the fact that it kind of actually came into form as a book is it has like a very dear place in my heart just because of how hard it was.
I had a very similar experience. The first book is the only one that's out, but the second one is finished, and I'm starting to write the third one now. And the second one was so much harder than the first one. And I kind of love the first one because that's where you meet the characters and kind of get wrapped up in the action. But I really enjoyed the second one, as hard as it was, because for the second one, you're already introduced to the characters, and so you're really going deep into them. And I know my characters, you see kind of their dark side in the second book, and so I liked being able to explore that depth.
I find that I love every book in my series more than the one before it. And the reason is because in the Lunar Chronicles, we kind of build a cast as we go along. So like in the first book, there's Cinderella and Prince Charming. And then the second book, there's still Cinderella and Prince Charming, but there's also Little Red Riding Hood and Big Bad Wolf. And so as you go on, they kind of all meet up and join forces together, and they all end up as these crew members aboard a spaceship. And I don't know if there's any Firefly fans in the audience. Yeah? And that was like such a big inspiration for me, because what I loved about Firefly was that you have this cast of people all stuck on a spaceship together, and they're so different and unique, and getting to see them, interact with each other is like the best part of that show. And so for me, I get to kind of do that with my own characters in the later books as the cast grows and grows.
Yeah, that's a super hard question, just because I was thinking about it because I got to think while you guys were answering. I was like, how do you feel so much for each book by the time it's on the shelf that it's a lot of feelings by that point. You've generally spent a lot of time with that book. So I'm always tempted to answer the one that hasn't come out yet. but no, I have a very special place for the archive because it kind of lived in my head for about 3.5 years. All of the pieces were there, and it didn't really come together until the day after I had graduated from college and the year which had just gone on submission. I was feeling very, very lost, and started driving home from graduation back to Tennessee, and on that car ride, something about it, all of these elements that I'd kind of been living with for a very long time just kind of started to come together. And it was a really exciting experience to write, and it has some of my favorite characters that I've ever written, and so I think I have a very intense feeling for that book. Mind you, the sequel has been kicking my butt royally for more than a year now, so ask again later, it probably will still be the archive and not unbound. But yeah, I think you live with these books for a long time.
I don't actually really have favorite books, but I have favorite scenes in the books. For the first book, my favorite scene is the scene that is the page that only has one sentence on it. And then for the second book, my favorite part is the page that only has one word on it. There's a theme here. For the third book, my favorite one is the page that's entirely blank. I love it. It was so easy to write that one. No, it was so fast. I just hit next page. Right here.
What was your childhood like?
What was our childhood like? That's a very broad question. I think I had a wonderful childhood. I have, very loving parents and a brother who is sometimes loving, as big brothers are. But I was also always very nerdy. I was a very shy kid, very bookish. And it wasn't really until I was maybe in late middle school that I started to gather people around me who were also like that. And then I'm like, yay, you like anime too, let's be best friends forever. So once I, found friends that really I could associate with, and who felt all the fanishness along with me, then it was awesome. But that took some time to find people who, shared similar interests.
I was a really strange child. No, I'm an only child, so I'm a little odd to begin with. I feel as an only child, you're predisposed to storytelling because you live with yourself a lot. You entertain yourself a lot. But I was that very strange child that executed teddy bears. Parents would come home from work and they would execution of teddy bears. And they would at all. But they had a story behind it. You see, I had come up with a story for that. No, but I also had a very strange childhood because my family moved a lot, and so I never really got to put down roots anywhere. And I think being predisposed to like create stories and live in my own head anyway, I became even more comfortable doing that, like creating fantasies, because I didn't really have a concrete reality. So yeah, I was that kid that like even before I wanted to write fiction, I was always living out fantasy in my head. And I had a kind of, even to this day, I am really bad at like reality. Like adulthood, reality, anything that doesn't involve like magic and shadows and stuff, like I'm not very good with it.
I had a very normal childhood until I was about 12, and then I got a letter to go to Hogwarts. And then everything changed. Speaking of Hogwarts, if you know Hermione Granger, before she was friends with Harry and Ron, and she was kind of stuck-up little teacher's pet, yeah, it was totally me. I was such a little nerdy kid, and I would always get extra credit for common. And I would take the big, really thick books home and check them out of the library. I'm like, I'm totally going to read Charles Dickens. And I never actually did because it was really boring. But I pretended I did. I was a really nerdy kid. And I liked school, but it wasn't until college that I started realizing that I could have fun and a life and do fun things too. So I really liked college. Skip everything before that.
Like Victoria, I am also an only child, and yeah, when you're an only child, you live in your head a lot. Like, I think I executed some Barbie dolls, possibly. Yeah, right? You work with what you have, teddy bears and Barbies, you know? Yeah, like I remember, and I had like a lot of spare time, you know, on the side, because we moved quite a bit when I was very, very little too. And so I would spend a lot of time, like, I remember my very first year in America, my mom was working at a restaurant, and she would take me there just so she could kind of have me around, and they kept me in this broom closet in the back, and they put like this little tiny TV in there that had like 2 channels that showed like cooking shows and news. I didn't care what it was. I couldn't understand English, so I was like, whatever. And I just spent like all day in there in the dark, just like thinking of stories. And I would go home and like draw them. I loved it because like at the end of the day, they would bring me this big bowl of food. Anyway, so that was like my first year. And then afterwards, when I was in elementary school, I loved that broom closet. It was awesome. So after I got like a computer desk and everything, you know how like there's the empty space under your computer desk where you push the chair into? So I built like a little fort down there. You put this like curtain down there that like made it into this little room, and I made like little cardboard bookshelves that didn't hold anything really. They weren't very strong, and I would tape them on the side, and I just sort of turned it into like this little world, and I would build these elaborate like Lego castle building things, and I would take my Barbies and like chop their heads off, right? And it was like this little world, and I would create stories there, and I would like draw little, usually dark things, and put them on the wall. And yeah, my parents thought I was crazy because I would just sit there and just like talk to myself and like make up stories. I would go she would take me to Walmart, you know, and I'm just like talking to myself the whole way. she's like, oh my God, we're gonna have to do something.
I had a really good childhood. I grew up in this bookstore that my parents owned, and it was right down the street from our house, and so I lived there. Like they literally like had a bassinet behind the counter, and I was raised there and everything. And when people hear my book title, Madman's Daughter, they always ask me, is my dad a madman? And just for the record, he's not. He's a lovely person. He's very thin. But as a child, I lived in my head as well. Even though I had a really happy childhood, I just always felt like I was waiting for something to happen to me, like something wonderful. And so I kind of just went through life waiting. And it wasn't really until much later that I realized, oh, you have to like make things happen for yourself. And being a writer is so perfect for that because now I can like create my own adventures in my head and kind of like live out a lot of what I wanted on the page and have these adventures and everything exist. Yes, let's see. Oh, how about you here in the front?
Who were your favorite characters to write in each book?
I had, in The Madman's Daughter, there is a madman, and he's a mad scientist, and he is experimenting on animals, and he has devised a way to turn them, give them human characteristics so they can walk and talk and they look kind of human. And one of these characters is named Balthazar, and he is a very sweet, he looks like a monster. I mean, he's huge, he's hulking, he's kind of hunchback, he's really hairy. So everyone's terrified of him, but he's actually really sweet and caring and loyal. And I think of all the characters, a lot of characters are human, but I think he's actually the most human of all the characters at heart. And I have a special place in my heart for him.
I love Balthazar, by the way. He's like my favorite character. He's really sweet. I think the character I had the most fun writing was in book 2. Well, she's in book 1 too, but she has like a bigger role in book 2, and her name is Kaede, and she's like this. She's like a revolutionary. She's really arrogant and cocky and in your face, and she's a fighter pilot. And that's her thing. And like when I was a kid, I wanted to be a fighter pilot. I remember telling my mom when I was 9, I was like, "Mom, when I grow up, I'm going to be a fighter pilot." And my mom was like, "You have really bad eyesight. But then it's like, you're be a fighter pilot." And it's like, also, you have no sense of direction. 2 very important criteria for flying a jet. And I was like, and I was convinced that I was going to be one, but until I realized, I was like, okay, yeah, my eyesight is actually really bad. I'm going to write about fighter pilots. So I ended up writing this girl. And she's sort of like my wish fulfillment character, and I remember I wrote this one scene towards the end of book 2, which was totally, like, if you read it, you know I had way too much fun writing this scene. It was like this dogfight in the air where she's trying to escape from enemy fighter jets, and it just goes on, and I'm just like, and then another jet started chasing her, and then there were explosions, and then she turned her jet. Anyway, I could go on forever about this. But I loved writing her just because she was kind of like who I wish I could be, someone who's like just super in your face and really good at piloting jets, apparently.
If we talk about our favorite character, my favorite character is Harley, who's only in the first book, and I really like Harley. And I was really kind of mad at myself for what I did to him, even though it was kind of awesome. But the character I had the most fun writing was entirely different. And all y'all who were in the earlier session, you've already heard this story. So when I was writing Across the Universe, I was a teacher at the time. And I had this student who was horrible. I mean, God bless his heart, he never shut up, and he just always talked, and it was painful sometimes to hear him. And y'all know, you know somebody like this. And so I was doing my planning period, instead of like grading papers and planning lessons like you're supposed to do, I was a terrible teacher. I was writing my book. And as I mentioned, it is a murder mystery in space. And for there to be a murder mystery, there has to be murders. And for there to be murders, there needs to be dead people. So I got to the point in the book where I needed a dead guy, and I totally killed off Ben for like 4 pages straight. So much fun. Nobody's going to remember how weird you were, Victoria. You're going to be like, that bloodthirsty bad. I really did kill him for so long. I actually had to cut it down in the book. So if you read the book and the first death, you're like, this death goes on forever. It was twice as long originally. I just kept killing him, and his eyes were bulging out, and he drowned, and it was just disgusting and so wonderful. And that was the most fun I've ever had writing.
Well, on that note. I'm so opposite. I love writing the like super quirky, funny, charming characters. So in my series, my 2 favorites are Eco, who is Cinder's like android sidekick. And when I first started writing her, I thought she was going to be like your typical artificial intelligence robot, like very practical and serious and, you know, and then I started writing it, and in this first chapter, she rolls into the scene, and she just starts spouting like the most ridiculous things, and is like, I want to go to the ball and wear pearls, and I have a crush on the prince, and we're going to dance, and anyway, so I was like, where did this robot come from? And so she's always really awesome and fun to write. And then my other favorite character is you meet in book 2, and it's Captain Carswell Thorne. And he's my sexy spaceship captain, which, you know, every good sci-fi series needs.
Goes ahead, sexy spaceship captain. So, and he's like very Han Solo-esque, where he's like super arrogant and like a ladies' man, and he also just has a tendency to say the most off-the-wall, ridiculous things in the most inopportune times. So I always love him. Yeah, I like writing with strange secondary characters. In The Near Witch, it was these two old women, Magda and Dreska, who are these sisters that live in the village here and might be witches. And they're just one is like, I mean, in fairy tale fashion, like one is super tall and thin and one is super short and large, and like their banter back and forth the whole time is like, just, it cracked me up. Like they were the strangest little, I like writing like little old women. It's a very strange thing. I don't know why. And they were siblings. I had like this infatuation with siblings because I don't have any. So I love writing them. They make me smile. But in the archive, there's this character named Roland. And Roland is a librarian in the archive, and I like writing him so much because originally he was like a total throwaway character, so I decided to base him very heavily on David Tennant from Doctor Who, like 10th Doctor. And I thought, like, this would be great because he only shows up in like one page, so I can like picture him and describe him however I want to. And then over the course of revisions, he became a more important person, and then I was kind of like, oh, well, David Tennant gets to stick around a little bit while. And like, so now like in book 2, he's like a really important person. All I can think is like every time he comes up in a scene, I'm like, hey, David Tennant. Nice to see you again. So I like writing him in because he is David Tennant. Can't get enough. You want to pick our next person? Sure. Hands up again. Yeah, right in the center.
What were the books or who were the writers that were important to you all when you were middle grade or high school readers?
Do you want me to go first since I have a mic? I wear a bracelet that says, what would Neil Gaiman do? Neil Gaiman is this author. Yeah, no, I really do. And that's because, like, Neil Gaiman, he's one of my favorite authors today, but he was one of my favorite authors growing up for a very different reason. It wasn't even at the time when I was in middle school and high school that I was the biggest fan yet of everything that he'd done. It was because he was a writer that was doing whatever spoke to him. Like, you know, we get an idea sometimes as writers that we have to do a certain thing, that you have to stick with a certain form. And this was a writer who did comic books and did fiction and had books of poetry and short stories and was just constantly creating, but there was no form aside from what seemed to be striking his fancy. And as like a strange little teen girl poet that had no idea what she wanted to do and just constantly wanted to be creating in some form, like the potential of him spoke to me immensely, the idea that I could. So he has remained like an idol of mine over the course. I'm also a huge fan of his work, but I'm also a fan of the variety of it.
For me, I think the two most influential books for me were The Giver by Lois Lowry and The Lord of the Rings, which is 3 books, but whatever. And the reason they were so big to me is because Lord of the Rings was the first high fantasy that I read, The Giver was the first dystopian that I read, and they were both just these completely brand new, unique worlds. I had never read anything like them before, and they just introduced me to this idea that not only can writers, you know, tell stories and write about cool characters doing cool things, you can create an entirely new world, like a new planet, a new universe. And as a reader, writers could take me there to these brand new places, and that was just so novel to me, and really inspiring.
For me, in elementary school, it was definitely the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. I have a very vivid and distinct memory of being in my local public library, and they had a staircase that you can kind of hide under, which you weren't supposed to, but I totally did. And so I remember reading Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe underneath the staircase and realizing that there was a different story than the one that was on the page, and that it could be 2 things at once, and that there were symbols involved. And that's a very obvious book. Like, I'm sure a lot of you adults are like, well, yeah, duh. But, I mean, as a young child, reading that was groundbreaking to me. This idea that a book could be more important than just the one single story it's telling, that it's actually telling something else. So that totally changed my life. And then, as cheesy as it sounds, the next one that totally changed my life was J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter. Because as I mentioned, I was Hermione Granger. And I went to school to be in literature, and I was an English literature major. And I had this very stuck-up idea of what it took to be a writer and what it took to be an English major. And I was like, I'll read the classics and Shakespeare and blah, blah, blah. And reading Harry Potter made me realize that there could be something that was fun and entertaining, but also had a lot of depth to it. And that totally shook my world, because it made me realize that I could write stuff that wasn't boring, but also important. So that was a big changer for me.
Yeah, J.K. Rowling also rocked my world when I was young. When I was really young, like 5 to 10 or so in elementary school, I read a lot of animal books. I think every animal book under the sun. I read like all the Black Stallion books, Black Beauty, Shiloh, Sounder, Where the Red Fern Grows. If it had an animal in it, I read it. Julie of the Wolves was a favorite of mine. The one that really solidified my love for fantasy and later on sci-fi was Brian Jakes' Redwall series. And I know it's like about mice, but it was like the first high fantasy that I had ever read. And I have also like a very distinct memory of reading this book. I mean, I remember seeing the cover of Madameo, which is one of the books in the series, in my bookstore library, and in my school library, and I just thought that it was really odd. There's this warrior mouse in this outfit, and he has like a sword, and I'm like, what is this? And I just kept walking past it for like 6 months, and finally I was like, I gotta read this thing because it's just driving me crazy. So I read it, and I just fell in love. And then from that point on, I read almost nothing but fantasy and sci-fi. That was like my gateway into Lord of the Rings, Robert Jordan, David Eddings, all the sort of founding people of fantasy, and then later on like Ender's Game and Shadow, all of those books.
I would say Lois Lowry's The Giver was also very influential for me, and Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game. I love twists, and that was one of the first books I read that just totally took me by surprise. And any book with a twist, any movie with a twist, I'll watch it, doesn't matter. I just love to try to guess. But when I was a teenager, I also read the classics. Not because I had any kind of high literary aspirations or anything, but the classics are so juicy. And people don't realize this, but there is tons of love and kissing and like sword fights and people getting their heads chopped off and like mistaken identity. And so I mean books like Frankenstein and Jekyll and Hyde and Wuthering Heights, I read not because they were, well written, although they are, but I just thought they were really thrilling and exciting. Oh, okay, let's see. How about you in the front?
What was the original titles of your novels? Like, saying they changed through the publishing process?
My title, The Madman's Daughter, was the original title that I was working with, and I think publishers about 50% of the time stay with the working title, and but they have every right to change it if they want to change it. And I was actually really excited to see what they would come up with, them being marketing geniuses and everything. And they came up with The Madman's Daughter. But it really works well for the book. It speaks a lot to the time period. The book is set in Victorian England, a time when women really didn't have many options, and they kind of defined themselves by the men in their lives. And the character feels very much that way, that she's defined by her father. And so part of the story, and in the later books, is about her breaking away from that and kind of becoming her own person.
I'm really awful at coming up with titles. I didn't come up with any of my titles. My original title for Legend was Republic, which nobody liked but me. And everyone was like, this sounds like a history book, you can't call it Republic. Everyone's going to think it's about the founding of America. And I was like, well, it's kind of about the founding of America in the future. But nobody liked it, so they changed it to Legend. The original title for Prodigy was Patriot, which nobody liked. Well, actually, no. A few people like my editor liked it, a few people liked it, but enough people didn't like it that we had to change it to Prodigy, because Patriot also sounded like a history book. So.
Originally, it was just that sci-fi book that didn't have a title for it. And then I really liked the Beatles, so Across the Universe was the song that I kind of listened to a lot when I was writing, so kind of jokingly named it Across the Universe. But in my head, I was like, they're never going to accept that one because there's a song on it, and they've made a movie out of it, and I was like, there's no way they're going to take that one. So I deleted that title, and I put A Long Way Home as the title when I submitted it. And I sent it to my agent that way, and then she sent it to my publisher. And I was like, all right, this is the title. And then they get on the phone with me, and they're like, well, obviously we're going to change that terrible title. I'm like, okay. And we kept coming up with titles over and over and over again. And